You want to know what authority really is? Let me tell you what I've seen. Every civilian thinks they understand how military command works. They've seen the movies. The officer points, the men charge forward, the enemy falls. Clean, simple. The man with the bars on his collar gives an order, and soldiers follow it, because that's what soldiers do. Rank creates obedience. Obedience creates results. That's the comfortable version. And it's a lie. Not a complete lie, that would be easier to spot. It's the kind of lie that has just enough truth in it to survive. Yes, there's a chain of command. Yes, orders flow downward. Yes, soldiers salute and say, yes, sir. But here's what the movies never show you. A piece of paper signed in some rear area office can make men salute. It cannot make them trust your judgment when shells are falling. Those are different things. And in combat, only one of them matters. Let me show you what I mean. Italy, 1943. Picture a trench line that's been rained on for 4 straight days. The mud is ankle deep in the good spots, knee deep in the bad ones. A German machine gun position sits about 200 yards ahead. It's killed 6 men this week. 6 men who had names, who had mothers back home, who made the mistake of moving when the German gunner was watching. The squad knows that position. They've been watching it for 16 hours, timing the firing patterns, mapping the approaches, identifying the dead ground where a man might crawl without getting his head shot off. They know how to take it. They've been planning. Then a captain shows up, clean boots, map in his hand. He's been in country maybe 3 weeks, sent forward from division headquarters because somebody decided this position needed an officer's attention. He looks at the map. He looks at the German position. He gives an order. Frontal assault. Straight across the open ground. The open ground that's been turned to soup by 4 days of rain. The open ground that the German gunner has been watching for a week. His rank says he's in charge. His plan says everyone's dead. Now, here's the part nobody talks about. What happens next? The textbook answer is simple. Soldiers follow orders. That's what discipline means. That's what training produces. The officer commands, the men obey. But the real answer is more complicated. The sergeant, a man who's been fighting since Sicily, who has more time under fire than this captain has weeks in uniform, looks at the ground for a long moment, doesn't argue, doesn't say anything that would get him court-martialed, just says, quiet and respectful, "Sir, why don't you let us work around to the left? We've got the timing on their gun." Said it quiet, said it respectful. But there wasn't a man in that trench who didn't understand exactly what was happening. The captain had formal authority. The sergeant had real authority. And everyone present, including eventually the captain himself, understood which one would determine whether they lived or died that day. This is the misconception about authority that nobody wants to examine. We think it transfers like property. Sign the paper, pin on the rank, receive the power. But authority isn't property. It's a relationship. It exists between people, not on paper. And you cannot sign a relationship into existence. The system that creates officers, the training, the tests, the evaluations, has no way to measure what actually matters when men's lives are at stake. You can score perfectly on tactics and logistics and weapons maintenance. You can present yourself well, speak confidently, lead training exercises where nobody actually dies if you make a mistake. And you can still freeze solid the first time shells start falling around you. The gap between what gets a man promoted and what makes men trust him with their lives is enormous. And that gap is where soldiers die. You can make men salute. That's discipline. You can make them stand at attention. That's training. You can make them follow orders to a point. That's the fear of court-martial. What you cannot make them do is believe you know what you're doing when everything is chaos and the wrong decision means they die. That's earned. Not given. Earned. And here's the uncomfortable part. This comfortable fiction persists because too many people benefit from it. Officers need to believe their rank means something beyond bureaucratic convenience. Generals need to believe their command structures function as designed. Civilians need to believe that military operations are rational and controlled, that the men sent to die are being directed by competent authority. Everybody benefits from maintaining the myth. except the men in the mud, except the soldiers who bleed out because someone with clean boots thought a piece of paper made him competent. The captain's boots told you everything you needed to know about how long he'd last. Clean boots mean rear echelon. Clean boots mean hasn't been where we've been. Clean boots mean authority that hasn't been tested yet and might fail the test when the shooting starts. So hold that image, the trench, the mud, the captain with his map and his plan that everyone knows is wrong. Hold the question it raises. What does authority actually mean when lives are at stake? And if rank doesn't create it, what does? There's a visual test that every combat soldier learns to read. It happens instantly, unconsciously, the moment someone new shows up. You don't even think about it. Your eyes just go there. The boots. Clean boots mean rear echelon. Clean boots mean fresh from somewhere they weren't being shelled. Clean boots mean someone who's been sleeping in a building, eating hot food, sitting at a desk while you were digging holes in frozen ground and praying the artillery would land somewhere else. Muddy, cracked, worn-down boots tell a different story. They mean time at the front, days or weeks in conditions where cleaning anything is a joke. They mean someone who knows what you know because they've lived what you've lived. When a man with clean boots starts giving orders, every soldier in the unit understands exactly what they're looking at. Formal authority that hasn't been tested. Theoretical command. A question mark wearing lieutenant's bars. Now, that doesn't make clean boot officers bad people. Many of them are trying their best. Some of them will turn out to be excellent under fire, calm, smart, decisive. But nobody knows that yet. Including them, they're unproven. And in combat, unproven authority is a gamble that other men pay for if it fails. Let me show you how this plays out. The sergeant has been fighting since Sicily. Look at his boots. They're cracked, caked with mud from 3 countries. He's lost weight. His uniform hangs on him. His eyes have that hollow look that men get after too much combat, when they've seen too many friends die and they've stopped expecting to survive themselves. He knows where the German guns are because he's been watching them for 16 hours. He knows the terrain because he's crawled across it. He knows which men in the squad are reliable and which ones are starting to crack. He knows everything that matters, everything that will determine who lives and who dies in the next firefight. Then a captain arrives, map in his hand, confidence in his voice, boots that still shine. Watch the men. Watch where their eyes go. First to the boots, that instant assessment. Then to the sergeant. Then back to the captain, but different now. Polite, attentive, obeying, but not trusting. Not yet. Watch what happens when the captain finishes giving his orders and the sergeant makes a suggestion. The transfer of real authority happens right there, in that moment, without anyone saying a word about it. The formal authority stays with the captain. He's still the officer, still the one who'll sign the reports, still the one who'll take credit or blame for what happens. But the real authority, the kind that determines what actually happens in the next hour, that shifts to whoever the men believe knows what they're doing. Sometimes that's the officer, sometimes it isn't. This isn't insubordination, it's survival. Men who follow untested authority off a cliff don't get medals, they get graves. So soldiers develop this instant assessment. Has this person been where I've been? Do they understand what we're actually facing? Have they earned the right to make decisions that might get me killed? The answers come from things you can't fake. The condition of their boots, the way they move under cover, fluid and automatic, or stiff and uncertain. The questions they ask. Do they want to know what the men on the ground have learned, or do they already think they know everything? Here's what the comfortable myth misses. Training can prepare officers for the administrative and tactical dimensions of command. How to read a map, how to call in artillery, how to organize a patrol. All of that can be taught. What can't be taught is the psychological dimension, making decisions when fear is screaming at you to freeze, staying calm when men are dying around you, thinking clearly when your body is pumping adrenaline and your brain is telling you to run. That's not taught. That's discovered. You find out if you have it the first time shells start falling and not one moment before. This creates a problem that nobody wants to acknowledge. Every new officer is an unproven hypothesis. The training suggests he'll be competent. The evaluations suggest he can lead. But the reality is that nobody knows, not his trainers, not his superiors, not even him, whether he'll function under fire until fire finds him. Some officers discover they have something, a quality that doesn't show up in training, that emerges only under pressure. They stay calm. They make decisions. Men look at them and see someone who knows what to do. They earn authority instantly in the first firefight, and they keep it. Others discover they don't have it. They freeze. They panic. They issue orders that make no sense. They're still officers, still have the rank, still sign the papers, but real authority has already left them. It shifted to whoever stayed calm. The men know. The sergeants know. Eventually, even the frozen officer knows. And there's no way to predict which one you'll be until you're there. The men with clean boots haven't faced that test yet. That's all their boots tell you, not that they're bad, not that they're incompetent, just that they're unknown, a gamble. And soldiers learn to read that gamble in an instant, without thinking, because their lives depend on reading it correctly. So what distinguishes the officers who earn trust from the ones who just have the insignia? It's not the training, everyone has that. It's not the rank, that's just paper. It's something that only emerges when the world is exploding around you and everyone is looking for someone who knows what to do. Real authority goes to whoever stays calmest when death is closest. That's the truth. And it has nothing to do with clean boots. Let me show you what authority actually looks like when it matters. Artillery starts falling. The first shell hits maybe 100 yards away, close enough to feel the concussion in your chest, far enough that you're still alive. Then another, closer. The Germans are walking their fire toward your position, and every man there knows what that means. In that moment, something happens that no manual accounts for. Time changes. All the things that mattered 5 minutes ago, rank, protocol, who reports to whom, the chain of command you memorized in training, it all becomes abstract, theoretical, distant. What matters now is simpler and harder. Who knows what to do? Your eyes find that man. Everyone's eyes find that man. It's automatic, unconscious, your brain making survival calculations faster than thought. You're not deciding to follow anyone. You're just looking for whoever is already moving, already solving, already calm. Sometimes it's the lieutenant. Sometimes it's a corporal. Sometimes it's a private who's been through more than anyone else in the unit and carries that experience in how he moves, how he sounds, how he looks at chaos and sees patterns instead of noise. Whoever it is, that's who you follow. Not because someone ordered it, because survival makes you smart. Picture this. It's night. Your position is being probed. Mortar fire walking toward you. Small arms fire pinging off rocks. The lieutenant is 3 months out of officer candidate school. This is his first time under fire. First time anything's been real. He's frozen. Not coward frozen, don't misunderstand. It's not that he's a coward. It's that there's too much happening. Too much noise. Too much input. Too many decisions that need to be made faster than his brain can process them. He's gripping his carbine so hard his knuckles are white, and his eyes are too wide, taking in everything and processing nothing. The sergeant has been doing this since Salerno. He's already moving. First squad, shift left. Second squad, hold here. Jones, get on that radio and call for support. He's not asking permission. He's not looking at the lieutenant for approval. He's making decisions because decisions need to be made, and right now he's the only one making them. Here's what matters. Nobody thinks less of the lieutenant. Not in that moment. He's not a coward. He's new. There's no shame in being new. Every soldier was new once. Every sergeant was green once. The judgment isn't about character. It's about capability. Right now, tonight, in this firefight, the lieutenant doesn't have it. The sergeant does. So authority shifts. Not officially, the lieutenant is still the officer of record, still the one who'll file reports and give briefings and wear the bars. But actually, the sergeant is in charge. Everyone knows it. The lieutenant will probably know it too, once his brain starts working again. And the unit will function. and men will probably survive, because the real authority ended up in the right hands. This is what combat teaches you about authority. It's organic. It grows where conditions allow it to grow. It dies where conditions kill it. You can't create it with a piece of paper. You can't destroy it by removing someone's rank. It exists in the relationship between people under pressure, in whom men trust to make decisions that might get them killed. Now let me show you the other side. Different unit, different night, different lieutenant. This one has been with his men 5 months. He was scared the first few times under fire. Everyone is every single time, and anyone who tells you different is lying. But he didn't freeze. He kept moving, made decisions. Some of them were wrong, but he made them, and he learned from the wrong ones, and he kept going. He listened to his NCOs. He didn't pretend to know more than men who'd been fighting longer. When a sergeant made a suggestion, he heard it, considered it, often followed it. He proved himself in 10 small ways that added up, not through any single act of heroism, but through consistent competence and the absence of fatal stupidity. 5 months of that, and now something's different. When mortars start falling, men look to him, not because they're supposed to, not because the manual says to, because they trust his judgment. They've seen him under fire. They know what he does when everything goes wrong. They've watched him be scared and function anyway, and that's earned something that no training program could provide. This lieutenant has both kinds of authority, the formal kind that came with his commission, and a real kind that came from 5 months of proving he deserved it. His unit operates differently because of it. Smoother, calmer, more effective. Because when the man who's supposed to be in charge actually is in charge, in every sense that matters, everything works the way it's supposed to. The contrast shows you what authority actually is. It's not the rank. The rank is just metal on cloth. Both lieutenants have the same rank. It's not the training. Both went through the same program. It's the relationship of trust that either exists or doesn't. The real authority flows toward whoever has demonstrated, not claimed, demonstrated calm competence when death was close. In one unit, that's the officer. In another, it's the sergeant. In some units, it shifts moment to moment depending on the situation. The system of real authority is fluid, responsive, always adjusting based on who's actually functioning and who isn't. The formal system just sits on top of that, issuing orders and filing reports. I've seen units where the company commander had total real authority, where men would follow him into anything because they'd seen him earn it. And I've seen units where the actual decisions were made by a staff sergeant while the captain just signed papers. Both can function. Both do function. The question isn't whether they work. It's what happens to men when the gap between formal and real authority gets too wide. When that gap gets wide enough, men die in it. That's what's at stake when we talk about authority. Not philosophy, not theory. Men bleeding out in the mud because the formal structure said one thing and the real structure said another, and the men on the ground couldn't navigate between them fast enough. So now you see how it actually works. Real authority flows toward whoever stays calmest when death is imminent, regardless of rank, regardless of training, regardless of what the table of organization says. But that raises harder questions. Why? Why does the system produce this gap between formal and real authority? Why can't training predict who'll be calm under fire? Why does something as important as combat command depend on qualities that can only be discovered when lives are already at stake? The answers are uncomfortable, and nobody wants to talk about them. Here's the part that makes everyone uncomfortable. The gap between formal authority and real authority exists because the systems that assign rank have no way to measure what actually matters. You can test a man on tactics. You can test him on logistics, map reading, radio procedure, weapons maintenance. You can evaluate his bearing, his speech, his performance in training exercises. What you cannot test is whether he can think clearly when the world is exploding around him. That quality, the thing that makes some men calm under fire and others useless, can only be discovered under conditions that cannot be simulated. You can't fake it in training. You can't create it in a classroom. You can't identify it in an interview. It either emerges when the shells start falling, or it doesn't. and if it doesn't, men die. Picture officer candidate school. Men learning tactics, logistics, procedures. They're taking tests. They're leading exercises. They're being evaluated on everything that can be measured. How well they present themselves, how clearly they communicate, how they handle mock challenges where the worst consequence of failure is a bad grade. They're scored. They're ranked. The best performers get the best assignments. The system works exactly the way it's designed to work. Now picture those same men 6 months later. They're in a trench. Artillery is falling. The men they're supposed to command are looking at them for decisions that will determine who lives and who dies in the next 10 minutes. Everything they learn becomes abstract. Tactics matter, but only if you can remember them when your hands are shaking so badly you can barely hold your carbine. Logistics matter, but only if you can think about supply lines while men are screaming and bleeding and dying 20 feet away. Communication matters, but only if you can form coherent sentences when every instinct in your body is telling you to run or freeze or curl up and make yourself as small as possible. What matters, the only thing that matters, is whether they can function when fear has its hands around their throat. That wasn't on the test. See, the military has a problem it can't solve. It needs officers. It needs to train them and evaluate them and assign them to units before combat happens. It can't wait until the shooting starts to find out who's competent. By then it's too late. So it has to select based on things it can measure. Test scores, training performance, evaluations, appearance, comportment. None of those things predict combat leadership. Some men who score well on tests freeze under fire. Some men who barely pass their exams turn out to be the calmest, clearest thinkers when everything goes to hell. There is no correlation, or rather, no correlation the military has ever been able to reliably identify between the qualities that make a man good at getting promoted and the qualities that make men willing to follow him when following might mean dying. The system selects for peacetime virtues and hopes they translate to combat. Sometimes they do. Sometimes a man who presents well and tests well and evaluates well also turns out to be calm under fire, decisive in crisis, worthy of the trust that combat demands. Sometimes they don't. And here's the part that really makes people uncomfortable. The system can't admit this. The military can't publicly acknowledge that its officer selection process doesn't guarantee combat competence. It can't say, the lieutenants we send you might be useless under fire. We have no way of knowing. That would undermine the entire premise of command authority. That would raise questions nobody wants to answer. So they don't say it, and men die in the silence. The brass writes reports. The training programs get tweaked. New evaluation methods are tried. But the fundamental problem remains. You cannot test for something that only reveals itself under conditions you can't create without actually putting men in combat. Combat leadership isn't taught, it's discovered. You find out if you have it when shells start falling. Not before, not in training, not in simulations, not in carefully designed exercises. Only when death is a real possibility. Only when fear is crushing your chest and your brain is screaming at you to run. Only then do you discover whether you can function. Some men discover they can. They surprise themselves. They didn't know they had this quality until they needed it, and then there it was. Calm, clarity, decisions that flow without conscious thought. They earn authority in that moment, and they keep it. Some men discover they can't. They freeze, or panic, or issue orders that make no sense. They thought they were ready. They passed the tests. They got the evaluations. But when it mattered, the quality wasn't there. Neither man knew in advance which one he'd be. Neither did anyone else. And that's why the gap exists. The system that assigns formal authority has no choice but to use criteria that don't predict what matters. And the real authority, the kind that makes men live or die, flows wherever it flows, regardless of what the paperwork says. The system isn't broken. It's working exactly as well as it can, given the impossible constraints. But working as well as it can still means men die when formal authority lands on someone who doesn't have real authority. Still means units function despite their officers rather than because of them. still means sergeants carry weight that should be carried by the men above them. That's just how it is. Nobody wants to hear it. But it's the truth. So the system can't predict real leadership. But men survive anyway. Units function despite incompetent officers. How? Through a process nobody talks about. A continuous, unofficial negotiation between obedience and survival. Every soldier learns to navigate this. It's not in the manual, it's not part of training, but it's essential knowledge, and you pick it up fast, or you die, or you get other men killed. Here's the situation. The man with formal authority gives an order that will get people killed. Not might get people killed, will. Everybody knows it. The sergeant knows it. The privates know it. Maybe even the officer knows it. Somewhere underneath the confidence that got him through training and the fear that's clouding his judgment now. What do you do? The textbook answer is follow orders. That's discipline. That's the chain of command. That's what separates a military from a mob. Orders flow downward, obedience flows upward, and the system works because everyone does their part. But the textbook wasn't written by men who watched friends die because someone with a title made a stupid decision. The textbook was written by men who needed soldiers to follow orders, not by soldiers who needed to survive following them. So men develop ways to route around bad authority without openly defying it. Picture this. A captain orders a patrol straight down a road that's obviously targeted for ambush. The road is the only straight line between 2 points, which means the Germans know exactly where any patrol will be. There's a bend where trees press close on both sides, perfect kill zone. Anybody with eyes can see it. Every man in the squad knows the order is wrong. The sergeant says quietly, respectfully, "Sir, maybe we sweep the tree line first. Give us better intel for the approach." He's not countermanding the order, he's interpreting it. The captain said patrol down the road. The sergeant is suggesting they patrol the area around the road first. It's not defiance. It's professional input from an experienced NCO. If the captain has any sense, he agrees. The patrol goes through the trees instead of down the road. Men survive. The mission gets accomplished. The official record shows the captain gave orders and the patrol was successful. Everybody wins. If the captain insists on his original order, if he's too green or too proud or too scared to admit he might be wrong, then the sergeant has a harder choice to make. And soldiers learn how far they can push. They learn the vocabulary of indirect resistance, questions that make officers reconsider, suggestions that reframe bad orders into survivable ones, interpretations that preserve the spirit of the command while avoiding its lethal letter. It's not a clean answer, it's a compromise, but it's how units actually survive. And here's the weight of it. Every soldier carries questions about authority that can never be fully resolved. When is obedience more important than judgment? When does following orders become complicity in getting men killed? Where's the line between professional deference and moral cowardice? There's no clean line. There's just the situation in front of you, the order you've been given, and the men whose lives depend on what you do next. The sergeants and corporals who navigate this, who route around dysfunction, who translate impossible orders into survivable missions, who carry the real weight of command while someone else wears the insignia. They're the invisible heroes of every army. They never get credit. The official history says the officers led and the men followed, but the men who were there know who actually kept them alive. When a good NCO gets killed, units fall apart in ways that losing an officer rarely causes. Because the NCO was doing the actual work of leadership, the reading of men, the assessment of situations, the quiet corrections that kept bad decisions from becoming catastrophes. The officer just signed the papers. This isn't cynicism, it's reality. Some officers deserve their authority and some don't, and the system has no way of knowing which is which until the shooting starts. So soldiers learn to read the gap and navigate it. They learn to make the formal structure work despite itself. It's the only way to survive. And they carry that skill, that compromise, that continuous calculation of how much obedience is enough and how much is too much for the rest of their lives. It doesn't turn off when they come home. They're still reading authority, still assessing competence, still watching for the gap between formal position and actual capability. The difference is that in combat, the gap could kill you. In civilian life, it just makes you tired. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable for civilians. Everything I've just told you about combat, the gap between formal authority and real authority, the way trust flows toward competence instead of rank, the shadow system of negotiation that keeps units functional, none of that is unique to the military. It's just more visible there. Combat strips away pretense. When men die from incompetent leadership, you can't hide it. When the gap between formal authority and real authority gets too wide, you count the cost in body bags. The truth is obvious because the stakes make it obvious. But the same pattern exists everywhere. Every organization has two hierarchies, the one on paper and the one that actually works. Think about any corporation. There are executives with titles, vice president of this, director of that. Their names are on the org chart. They have offices and assistants and parking spaces that say who they are. That's the formal hierarchy. Now think about what happens when something goes wrong. A product fails, a scandal breaks, a crisis hits that wasn't in anybody's business plan. In the first few hours, everybody follows the org chart. The VP makes statements. The director convenes meetings. The formal structure does what it's designed to do. But watch what happens as the pressure builds. The CEO is giving interviews, but who are the junior people actually calling for guidance? Not the CEO. They're calling the senior engineer who's been through crises before and knows what actually works. They're calling the operations manager who knows where everything is and how things really get done. They're calling the executive assistant who's been there for 20 years and has the institutional memory to navigate any problem. Same pattern as combat. Same truth about authority. The formal leader and the actual leader are sometimes different people. In routine operations, you might not notice. The formal hierarchy coasts some procedure, and everything looks the way it's supposed to look. But crisis reveals the real structure. Crisis shows you who people actually trust, regardless of titles. I've watched this happen everywhere, not just in war. Hospitals, where the doctor of record and the nurse who actually catches the mistakes aren't the same person. Schools, where the principal has the title, but the veteran teacher in room 12 is who everyone actually listens to. Families, where the parent who's nominally in charge and the parent who actually makes things work are different people in ways the children understand perfectly. The military didn't invent the gap between formal and real authority. The military just makes it impossible to ignore. Here's something else that translates directly. Every organization has people who bridge that gap. In combat, it's the sergeants who translate impossible orders into survivable missions. In corporations, it's the senior employees who work around incompetent management, the middle managers who shield their teams from dysfunction above, the experienced workers who train new bosses without anybody acknowledging what's happening. These bridge builders are what keep flawed systems functional. They compensate for the gap between position and competence. They make it possible for organizations to survive leadership that doesn't deserve its authority. And like in combat, they rarely get credit. Recognizing them would mean acknowledging the incompetence they compensate for. So officially, the executives led and the company succeeded. The people who actually made it work, who routed around the dysfunction, who caught the mistakes, who did the real thinking while someone else gave the speeches, they stay invisible. I learned to read this pattern in the mud of Italy. I learned it when misreading meant dying, and I've never been able to unsee it since. Once you understand that formal authority and real authority are different things, that the person with the title and the person with the trust may not be the same, you start noticing it everywhere. You see who people actually follow in a crisis versus who they're supposed to follow. You understand why some leaders succeed and others fail, despite identical credentials. You grasp why some organizations function despite terrible management and others collapse despite brilliant executives. The gap between position and competence is universal. Combat veterans just know it in our bones, because we learned it when the stakes were life and death. The question is, what happens when someone who learned this truth under fire comes home to a world that still believes the comfortable myth? What happens when you can see what others can't, and they don't want to learn? Let me tell you about coming home. A veteran returns to civilian work. Maybe it's an office, maybe it's a factory floor, maybe it's a meeting room with a conference table and people in suits talking about quarterly projections. Doesn't matter. What matters is what he sees. He's sitting in a meeting. Someone with a title, manager, director, vice president, whatever the word is making a decision, and everyone in the room can see it's wrong. The people who actually do the work, who understand how things actually function, will have to live with the consequences. They can all see the decision makes no sense, but nobody says anything because of the title. The veteran has seen this before. The captain with clean boots ordering a frontal assault into a machine gun. The rank that commands obedience but hasn't earned trust. The gap between formal authority and real authority playing out in slow motion while people suffer the consequences of a decision made by someone who doesn't know what they're doing. But here's the difference. In combat, there were ways to navigate around it. The sergeant who makes a suggestion. The creative interpretation that saves lives without openly defying orders. The informal authority that routes around formal dysfunction. In this meeting room, there's nothing. No sergeant to quietly redirect. No informal authority that everyone acknowledges. Just the org chart and the title and the bad decision unfolding while everyone pretends the hierarchy works the way it's supposed to. The veteran watches. He could say something. He could point out what everyone already knows. But he's learned that civilian organizations don't work like that. The pretense has to be maintained. The boss has to be the boss. The comfortable fiction has to survive, even when survival means watching a predictable failure play out. So he stays quiet. And something inside him goes a little more distant. This is part of what veterans don't talk about. It's not the nightmares, though those exist. It's not the loud noises that make you flinch, though that happens too. It's the loneliness of seeing clearly what others prefer to miss. Combat teaches you to read authority dynamics with precision. You learn because misreading meant dying. You develop a sense, call it instinct, call it pattern recognition, call it whatever you want, for the gap between formal position and actual competence. You can walk into any organization and know within hours who really runs the show, regardless of what the org chart says. That skill doesn't turn off when you come home. So veterans see things. They see the manager who got the job through politics but doesn't understand the work. They see the senior people who actually make things function but never get credit. They see the dysfunction that everyone tolerates because challenging it would mean challenging the hierarchy. They see the comfortable myths that organizations maintain about themselves, and mostly they can't convince anyone else to see it. This creates isolation. Not the dramatic isolation of trauma, though that's real too, but the quieter isolation of understanding. When you've watched men die because formal authority didn't match real competence, it's hard to take minor dysfunction seriously, but it's also hard to ignore it. The pattern is the same, even if the stakes are different. The veteran sees a captain with clean boots every time an unqualified manager makes a bad decision. He sees the trench in Italy every time people follow orders they know are wrong because challenging the hierarchy feels impossible. He carries the war with him, not as flashback but as lens, a way of seeing that most people never develop because they never had to. And here's the thing about that lens. It's accurate. The veterans aren't wrong about what they see. The gap between formal and real authority does exist in every organization. The bridge builders who compensate for dysfunction are real. The comfortable myths that people maintain about their hierarchies are myths. Veterans see clearly. That's the problem. The civilian world needs its pretenses. Organizations function, in part, because people believe in them, because they accept that the boss is the boss for a reason, that the hierarchy works the way it's supposed to, that competence and position are aligned. Veterans have seen too much to maintain those beliefs. They know the system works despite itself, not because of itself. That knowledge creates distance. The veteran comes home to a world that operates on comfortable assumptions he can no longer share. He sees what others don't see. He knows what others don't know. And mostly, nobody wants to learn. Thank you for your service is meant kindly, but it doesn't bridge the gap. It acknowledges something without understanding it. The veteran nods, says you're welcome, and carries his knowledge alone. That's part of what we bring home. Not just the nightmares, not just the flinching at loud noises, the loneliness of seeing clearly in a world that prefers not to. And let me tell you about weight you can't see. When you've learned that authority is earned under pressure and that formal structures often don't map to competence, when you've learned it not from a book but from watching men die because the gap was too wide, you can't unlearn it. That knowledge becomes part of how you see everything. You come home to a world that still operates on comfortable myths. The boss is the boss because he deserves to be. The people in charge know what they're doing. The system promotes the competent. These are the stories people tell themselves because they need to believe them. They need the hierarchy to make sense. But you've seen what you've seen. You've seen officers freeze and sergeants step up. You've seen formal authority collapse and real authority emerge from whoever stayed calm. You've seen the gap between rank and competence filled with blood, with men who died because the system couldn't admit its own limitations. You can't go back to innocent belief in hierarchies after that. So you sit in meetings and you watch decisions being made by people who haven't earned the right to make them. You work under managers who have titles but not trust. You see, organizations maintain fictions about themselves that you know are false. And you can't say anything, or rather, you learn that saying something doesn't help. The world needs its pretenses. You just don't share them anymore. This is a weight that doesn't show. The veteran at the dinner party seems fine. He doesn't flinch at fireworks anymore, or maybe he still does, but he's learned to hide it. He holds a job. He pays his bills. He does all the things that normal people do. From the outside, he looks like he's adjusted. But inside, there's a distance. His coworker is complaining about their boss. You wouldn't believe what he did in the meeting today. The decision made no sense. Everyone could see it was wrong, but nobody would say anything. The veteran nods. He understands. But he's not going to say, "Let me tell you about watching men die," because someone with a title didn't have the competence to match it. Let me tell you about what it means when the gap between formal authority and real authority gets filled with blood instead of just wasted time and failed projects. The scale is wrong. It doesn't translate. So he stays quiet. He offers sympathy about the bad boss. He keeps his real thoughts, the comparisons he can't help making, the pattern he can't help seeing, to himself. Because what would be the point? It would just make people uncomfortable. It would just make him seem like he can't let go of the war. But that's not it. He's not stuck in the war. He's stuck with what the war taught him. This is the weight nobody sees. The visible wounds, the scars, the missing limbs, the injuries that show, those get recognition. People understand visible damage. But the invisible weight, the knowledge that isolates, the inability to share a worldview that was forged in circumstances most people can't imagine, that stays hidden, because there's no way to explain it that doesn't sound like either bragging or complaining. Because the gap between what combat taught and what civilian life assumes is too wide to bridge with words. And thank you for your service. What do you say to that? Your welcome seems wrong, like you're accepting thanks for something that shouldn't require thanks. Something that was just what had to be done. You don't know what you're thanking me for seems bitter. Silence seems rude. So you say, "You're welcome," and you nod, and you carry on. The gap remains. The knowledge stays unshared. The weight continues. Part of what veterans carry isn't trauma in the way people usually mean. Not the nightmares, not the flashbacks, not the clinical symptoms that get names and diagnoses. It's simpler and harder than that. It's knowing something that separates you from everyone who doesn't know it. It's seeing a pattern that others can't see. It's living in a world that operates on assumptions you can no longer share. Understanding too much can be its own wound. The veteran learned what authority really is. He paid for that knowledge with things that can't be measured, friends who didn't come home, months and years of fear that never fully leaves, the accumulation of horrors that become just another part of how you see the world. And now he has this knowledge, hard-won and accurate, and mostly nobody wants it. That's the isolation, not rejection. Nobody's rejecting him, just distance. The gap between someone who has seen something and someone who hasn't. A gap that can't be closed with words, can't be bridged with thank you for your service, can't be overcome by trying harder to fit in. It's just there, part of the weight, and you carry it. So what do we owe them? The men who learned what authority really is, who discovered in the worst possible classroom that rank doesn't equal competence, that trust is earned, not given, that the system works despite itself and the gap gets filled with blood. Those men paid for that knowledge. They paid with friends who didn't come home. They paid with years of carrying weight that doesn't show. They paid with the loneliness of seeing what others can't see. What do we owe them for that? Not parades. Parades are fine, I suppose, but they don't address the debt. A parade celebrates victory, acknowledges sacrifice in the abstract, makes civilians feel good about supporting the troops. It doesn't bridge the gap between what veterans know and what civilians believe. It doesn't honor the actual truth of what happened, not slogans. Thank you for your service is well meant, but it doesn't mean anything. It's a phrase people say because they feel they should say something, and they don't know what else to say. It acknowledges without understanding. It thanks without knowing what it's thanking for. Not sentimentality. The soft focus reverence, the talk of heroes and sacrifice and giving their all, that language doesn't honor veterans. It obscures them. It turns complex human beings who lived through horror and came out changed into cardboard symbols of virtue. It makes civilians feel good without requiring them to understand anything difficult. What we owe them is harder than any of that. We owe them the truth about what war actually is, not the movie version where officers give inspiring speeches and men charge into battle and victory is clean and noble. The real version, the one where authority is constantly being tested, where the man you follow might not be the man with the highest rank, where survival depends on everybody understanding what's real and what's just decoration. We owe them honesty about the gap they lived in, the gap between formal authority and real authority, the gap that gets filled with blood when it's too wide, the gap that exists in every organization but only becomes visible in combat because the stakes are life and death. We owe them acknowledgement that what they learned is true, that the comfortable myths civilians believe about hierarchy and competence are myths. We owe them the recognition that what they learned matters. Not as war stories, not as curiosities from an experience most people will never have, as knowledge, hard-won, paid for in full, applicable knowledge about how human beings actually organize themselves under pressure, knowledge that could make civilian organizations function better if anyone would listen, knowledge that could close gaps and prevent failures and save time and money and maybe even lives, if we took it seriously instead of filing it under military stuff and moving on. The men who learned what authority really is have something to teach. They paid the tuition. They did the work. They came home with understanding that most people never develop because they never face the conditions that force it. And mostly, that understanding goes unused. What a waste. What a waste that combat veterans see organizational dysfunction clearly and can't convince anyone to listen. What a waste that the hard lessons of war, lessons about competence and trust, and the difference between formal power and real authority, get compartmentalized as military experience and left out of civilian life. What a waste that people who know something true, something important, something that could help sit in meetings watching preventable failures unfold because nobody wants to hear what they learned. We owe them better than that. We owe them a world that listens, not out of sympathy, not out of guilt, out of simple recognition that they know something the rest of us don't, and maybe we could learn from it instead of just thanking them for their service and moving on. The dead don't need medals. They're beyond needing anything. But the living, the ones who carry this truth forward, who live with the weight of knowledge that isolates, who see what others miss and bear the loneliness of seeing, they need something. They need to know that what they learned matters, that it wasn't for nothing, that somewhere somebody's listening. That's the only honor that means anything. So here's what we've covered in this hour. The comfortable myth says authority flows down. Rank creates obedience. The chain of command works because it's designed to work. The officer commands, the soldier follows, and that's how military organization functions. The truth is harder. Authority is organic. It grows where conditions allow it to grow. It flows toward whoever stays calmest when death is imminent, regardless of rank, regardless of training, regardless of what the paperwork says. Formal authority can make men salute. Only earned authority can make them trust you with their lives. The gap between formal authority and real authority exists in every organization. Combat just makes it visible because failure means death. The same pattern, the same tension between position and competence, the same bridge builders who compensate for dysfunction, the same comfortable myths that have to be maintained, exists everywhere. Veterans see it clearly because they learn to read it under fire. The rest of us prefer not to look. What soldiers carry home isn't just nightmares, it's knowledge. Understanding that most people never develop because they're never forced to. A way of seeing that reveals what others miss. And the loneliness of seeing clearly in a world that needs its pretenses. We owe them truth. We owe them recognition that what they learn matters. We owe them a willingness to listen instead of just think. A piece of paper can make you an officer. Only men can make you a leader. The ones who taught us that difference. The ones who came home and the ones who didn't deserve to have their truth carried forward. Not as sentiment, not as soft-focused reverence for heroes, as fact, as knowledge, as understanding that costs more than we can imagine and means more than we usually acknowledge. That's what they died for. That's what the survivors carry. That's what authority really is.